Again, a different view of these data is to take an Aussie-centric or Australian-New Zealand-centric view of these data and see where we fit vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And so you can see we're way out to the right in terms of our performance, in terms of this is real output across, this is what I should mention, this is all agricultural outputs. There's about 156 commodities divided by these main labour measures. So our total output per unit of, per worker is pretty high. Notably, we started off back in 1961 with a higher labour productivity level than the US, and we're now substantially fallen behind the US. So our estimates are about $43,000 per worker in agriculture here, compared with about $70,000 output per worker in North America. Another view of the world is cut across here and compare us again to sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see that we're way out on the right in terms of output per worker, but we actually fall behind, not just in pixelated yield performance in sub-Saharan Africa, but on average in terms of land productivity. My estimates are that on average across all crops, sub-Saharan Africa is cranking out about $76 per acre, per hectare, and Australia is cranking out about $59 per hectare. So there's issues that I'll get to a little bit later about what's in the denominator here and how that might change your view. So just taking a crude count of workers and a crude count of acres, does that really give you many insights into productivity relativities that might be meaningful in terms of levels and trends and these indicators? But nonetheless, some views of where countries fit vis-a-vis each other in terms of these indicators. That sort of benchmark sort of general trends. I was going to introduce some ideas about whether or not we think agricultural productivity growth is slowing. And Julian and I and a few others have been interrogating some US data to death to try and understand that with respect to the US, and I'll give you a brief look at that and a brief look at what I think is going on or what we know might be going on globally. If you look at the US, and the US is worth worrying about, not just for its own sake and because it's a competitor to Australia, but it's also a big player with respect to global commodity markets. As I say, a big chunk of the world's corn crop comes out of there, and we're talking 10 to 15% of the entire world's wheat and more of the world's soybean crop. But good people beg to differ on just the simple views about whether we think multi-factor productivity growth is slowing in the US, where we think we've actually got comparably good data across the world. So our colleagues at USDA are pretty clear. They state that statistical analysis of their data does not provide evidence of a long-run productivity slowdown. And the folks on the bottom come to a very different view. They say there can be little doubt that in our data series, multi-factor productivity data exhibited evidence of a slowdown in the post-1990 period. So when we did this work, we had data running from 1990 up to 2002, compared with the earlier period running from 1949 to 1990. We've, in the last few months, updated our productivity estimates to 2007, and we still get this persistence of this slowdown. So what I've got here is graphs giving you the distributions across states in multi-factor productivity growth in this pre-1990 period vis-a-vis the post-1990 period. And putting these data together has been a labour of love. I started this work in the mid-80s, and Julian joined myself and a bunch of other folks a few years later, and it's one of these jobs that never ends. But we put them together with the explicit purpose of actually trying to account for as much of the measurable inputs used in agricultural production and take explicit account of changes in the compositional quality of big factors like capital, land and labour. So for example, we have 32 classes of labour by year, by state in this data series. It's all of this data we put together on a state level basis. We've broken out the land into 3 broad classes of land. We've done a lot of work on teasing out and rethinking and remeasuring capital service flow use, where we've disaggregated out against all types of capital, and even within that, a tractor in Minnesota is not the same as a tractor in Connecticut and so forth. So we've taken account of tractor size and combine size differentials over time across states and so forth, with the idea of trying to chip away in the spirit of Grillicus and Jorgis and so forth, and chip away at this residual we call productivity and see if we can actually measure input growth. We do that, and we get this slowdown, and it's a very substantial slowdown. We spend a lot of time doubting ourselves about this and rechecking the data and so forth, but we're going from an average across states in the 49 to 1990 period of just over 2% per annum growth in multi-factor productivity. It's essentially half that rate in the post-1990 period. Moreover, 44 of the 48 states have a statistically significant slower rate of growth in the post-90 period than the pre-90 period. So it's not just a few large states driving this US total, it's a fairly pervasive slowdown across the US. Notwithstanding our sensibilities on that data, we've just very recently, and Julie and I can find the time to finish this darn thing off and submit it, we pushed our multi-factor productivity estimate back again to the early part of the last century to try and get a bigger picture rather than just a post-Second World War picture on this evolution of multi-factor productivity. And what I'm reporting here is that what we did was we ran a series of dummy coefficients for 15 years through the data, and we stepped this window of dummy coefficients from now back through the data so that the coefficient, we were regressing this against the rate of growth of productivity, so the coefficient that I'm reporting here out of this regression represents the differential rate of growth, trend rate of growth in the 15-year window vis-a-vis the trend rate of growth in the 1910 to 2007 sample. So below the dotted line, it's a negative rate of growth in the window vis-a-vis the rest of the sample. If it's positive, it's growing at a faster rate of growth. Sorry, not negative rate, it's growing a slower rate of growth in the window vis-a-vis the rest of the sample. It's above the dotted line, it's growing at a faster rate of growth. Again, we've done multiple versions of statistical tests on this, and we get pretty unequivocal evidence of a slowdown in multi-factor productivity growth in the US in the post-1990 period. The interesting thing is, that we didn't know before we did this, is that the productivity performance in the US and perhaps elsewhere in the world that we've grown up with is essentially ahistorical. That actually, if you set aside this above long-run average rate of growth back in the latter part of the Second World War years, which you could put down with all sorts of abnormalities in the way those economies work, and look at the whole sweep of history for the last century in the US, this period, this block of time in the late 70s through the 80s, nudging up to the late 80s, is ahistorically high, so it looks way above the dotted line there, rates of growth of productivity relative to the rest of that entire century. So not only do we have a slowdown, but the performance just prior to that slowdown was ahistorical. If you look at another measure of, so that's the US evidence. If we go step back and look at these various metrics we've got of productivity performance globally, the old hobby horse is crop yields, which seems an easy thing to get, but harder than you think to get a comparative set of global crop yield data for these major crops. But we've now pushed those data back to earlier than that, but what I put here is the 1920, post-1920 series. From 1920 to 1960, you see average annual rates of growth well less than 1% per annum in maize, wheat and rice. In the 1960 to 1990 period, you see a substantial ramping up of the annual rate of growth during this period to over 2% for rice, well over 2% for wheat, and up 1.7% for maize. And if you look at the post-1990 period, the only commodity here, and in most of them that we looked at, is maize is the only one that's sustained its rate of growth of yields. Very substantial drop-off in wheat yields and rice yields and some other commodities. Globally, these are global average yields in the post-1990 period. If you go back to the Ratanogram and look at my land and labour productivity measures, and look at, again, these sort of differential rates of growth. Now we can only go back to 1961 for those, but from 61 to 90 to 90 to now being 2008. If you take the simple average across all the countries in their land productivity measures and their labour productivity measures, this is showing you averaging across all countries in the world. The land productivity, so the difference columns there is showing the rate of growth in the post-1990 period vis-a-vis the pre-90 period. So we have simple averages, land productivity growing at a slower rate of growth in the post-90 period and growing more or less about the same rate for labour productivity. If you just take weighted averages of the world, you get a slightly different perspective. You get differential land productivity in not dropping off in the post-90 period, and in labour productivity it's actually higher in the post-90 period than the pre-90 period. If you take out China, it's so darn big in the weighted average, it's enough to drive you back into a situation where for the entire rest of the world, on average, you've got slower rates of growth in both of these productivity measures, post-90 and pre-90. If you start slicing and dicing the data in different ways, so if you look at the important producers, so take 22 countries that account for 80% of the entire world's agricultural output, you get a post-90 growth rate in land and labour productivity that's higher than the pre-90. If you again strip out China, because they're in there, they're one of those 22, you get a diminution in land productivity growth rate. You still get a higher growth rate in labour productivity post-90, but it's substantially reduced compared with the N equals 22. And notably, if you take all the rest of the world combined, 158 countries, you get a very substantial reduction in these two productivity measures, post-90 versus pre-90. This may be like a rendergram here, but part of what I'm learning is that sort of simple notions of aggregate trends and so forth are insufficient to get an understanding. So the averages don't hold much information here. Because there's a huge, as I mentioned earlier, spatial dispersion in productivity performance. So rather than group countries regionally or group them by whether they're important in terms of agricultural production terms, what I've done is arrayed them here from left to right, from low to high per capita income, and looked at this pre-90 versus post-90 performance in the top part of the graph in land productivity and the bottom part of the graph in labour productivity. So if the bar chart's green, it says that they're growing faster post-90 in land and labour productivity. If it's red, they're growing slower. And you can see that I've divvied up the low, using the World Bank cut-offs, low, middle and high income countries. And been staring at this over the last few weeks, because we've only just finished this data over the last few weeks, and interesting sort of insight that if you take a split point, and I'll put the two arrows there roughly where this is an eyeball split point, and looked at these data, you can see in the land productivity, if you look at the higher income countries, there's a much more preponderance of red to the right of the split point and green to the left, and the reverse with respect to labour productivity, a higher preponderance of green to the right and red to the left. And very dramatic differences then when you look at the averages across countries in land and labour productivity before and after the split point, and they're flipped. So in the land productivity evidence we've got, there's been a substantial slowdown in land productivity growth rate for high income countries, with a breakpoint is around $5,500 per capita. And for $4,700 per capita, you get the reverse result, that the countries that are at the higher end of the spectrum in terms of per capita income have higher rates of labour productivity, so they're still flushing labour out of agriculture relative to the countries before the breakpoint. So, point to note here is that these means and medians and so forth are useful for summary statistics, but perhaps not particularly meaningful for understanding the sort of more general nature of productivity performance worldwide.